Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today it is the 21st of June, and today we're looking once again at many substantial updates to the front line. I will begin briefly by touching on Zaporozhye, but then we'll look once again at developments northeast of Pokrovsk and Murad, a really important part of the front line that we have to continue covering. We'll also look at Sumy because there is actually a scandal there surrounding the building of fortifications or lack thereof around the town Yablonivka, which has now become an epicenter of fighting between the Russians and Ukrainians over the past couple of days. So we're going to look at all of that along with the Ukrainians' formation of the 20th Army Corps. We'll look at the structure of that unit and all of the brigades that are within that new umbrella that's been created. So let's zoom in over here on the updates from Yunakivka. If you guys recall, I've been covering this town for the past couple of videos now due to recent Russian advances over here. And so the Russians were able to get that initial foothold that we talked about on June 13th. That's when it initially happened. And since then, they've been able to really facilitate the movement of ground forces. It's not really going on through armored vehicles or anything like that. It's being done on foot or perhaps by motorcycle. And now they've been able to push even deeper into Yunakivka. So they captured this territory and were able to advance 700 meters northwards. They were spotted in just a house right next to the local church, and they were targeted by the Ukrainian side by their tanks. And so for now, this is the current situation. It is contested with the Ukrainians holding on to the northern and western sections of the village. It seems like this was just a matter of opportunity. The Russian forces, they sensed that there was a gap in the Ukrainian line over here, and they had this route that they had facilitated for themselves that leads directly into the village. But it could actually give them access to this paved road that connects to, for instance, Poltavka to the north, or you move further westwards in Zeleny High and Vysoké. They're not really that well defended when it comes to their eastern flank, which is just completely open. And when you look at it, the much larger trenches that are supposed to defend against these sort of broad offensive activities, they are located, if we're going to measure it and be charitable, they're located at least 5 kilometers away from the current line of contact, if not 10, 12 kilometers away. And so that sort of buffer zone in between is still a location where the Russians can probe depending on whatever sort of opportunities are presented to them. But again, that's not a key part of the front line, and there aren't really any orders to do something of significance over there. Looking over here at Shevchenko, though, the Russians are continuing to push and have taken over much of the village, capturing nearly 2 square kilometers in the southern section of the settlement. And you can see over here, June 21st, the 31st Brigade, they conducted FPV strikes onto houses and tree lines along with nearby trenches. I would presume those trenches are located south of Shevchenko, although they aren't clearly visible on satellite imagery. Around Shevchenko, there actually are a lot of fortifications, and we've been covering them for months now because they basically act as this area that cordons between the border with Donetsk and Dnipro. You can see how it extends horizontally for roughly 30 kilometers along that horizontal plane. We can't even see the beginning of it from the west, but you can see how it sort of fizzles out by the east, where it arrives at the western bank of the Mokryali River Valley. And so the Russians are getting awfully close to overrunning this horizontal line of defenses, which is broad in terms of its span, but in terms of depth, when you look at the depth of these fortifications, it's only it amounts to like 3 kilometers of just layers of defenses. You have the main line over here, and then you have individual trenches that are supposed to protect against key entrances to certain areas. For instance, the entrance to a certain tree line or towards a paved road, or I suppose the flank of a village like Malivka over here. But the point really is that the Russians were able to push past Burlatske, find this weak point running along this route over here, and then enter into the southern quarter of the village, meaning that now they have a solid base through which to attack the northern quarter. And the Ukrainians simply don't have many organizational points or logistics hubs that are nearby to provide reprieve for the garrison that remains in Shevchenko. The nearest village is a hamlet, and it's 5 kilometers away. And the normal-sized village that we see over here, Voskrenska, it's really 6 kilometers away. So again, any sort of connectivity is certainly possible, but it becomes difficult and gives the Russians an opportunity to take over the village in its entirety, which would then give the Russians access to the open fields that are pushing westwards past this line of trenches that you see marked over here, and would arrive at the final village before arriving at the Dnipro border from another location. So the village over here is called Komishuvacha. again, rather isolated. This is a pattern with a lot of villages in this sort of tri-oblast area. They're small in size, and so once you get a foothold in them, it's very difficult to conduct counterattacks. And there aren't that many roads that are connecting between various towns. So having control over even one access point from a Russian perspective could completely disrupt Ukraine's frontline connectivity. And so that's why the Russians are pursuing the sort of advances over here towards the border region. But it comes at the same time the Russians are continuing to advance and close in on these regions that are just to the east of the Mokryali River that the Ukrainians have really come to a decision about withdrawing from. So we talked about this in previous videos about this large buffer area, this huge salient that's sort of sandwiched in between Odradny, Bakhatir, the Vovcha River line, and then the Mokryali River line to the west. An area that, like at its zenith, was probably like 30 square kilometers in size. Now you're seeing how it continuously decreases in terms of surface area due to the continued Russian captures of territory. You can see that over here, 10.5 square kilometers of open fields captured by the Russian side. When we look at the extent of the advance, though, it amounts to about nearly 5 kilometers pushing westwards, meaning that the Russians are closing in on this final salient over here. I want to just get an idea of the scale of this. I want to quantify it. You can see it amounts to about 20 square kilometers. So that is still a significant portion of territory that is being held onto by a small amount of Ukrainian forces that are just trying to increase the sort of liminal period before the Russians are able to fully correct the front line. But at the same time, the majority of the Ukrainian forces over here, along with their drone operators, are preparing to dig in along this line of the Mokryali River Valley, along all these villages that you see marked over here that previously were not even close to Russian forward artillery shelling. Now they actually are within the purview of those short-range artillery firings or mortars or such. And obviously, there are a lot of drone strikes going on at ground zero of the front line. And the Russians have already partially infiltrated this new Ukrainian fallback line by entering and allegedly capturing Zaporizhia, which is this hamlet over here. So you can see there's a geolocation that basically backs up my reporting from the previous video. It's from the 36th Motor Rifle Brigade. So they captured the village according to them, but the geolocation doesn't show their capture of the western chunk of the village. But certainly they raised their flag in the east. So Russian sources claim that they were able to destroy in the process of the fighting one platoon's worth of men from the 37th Marine Brigade, which is one of these units that is defending around here. So that would be between 20 to 50 soldiers in size. And destroy, usually that connotation could either be killed or wounded. And so again, it is rather small hamlets. And so I would always go on the lower end for those estimations. But in any case, they now have a direct route to sort of cut off the connection between the southern chunk of the Mokryali River garrison, the one that is actually fighting in contested areas like Peribudova or Mirny, areas that are much farther away from Ukraine's logistics and their sort of main rear garrisons like Havrylivka, Ivanivka, and Novopavlivka. Those are the three most important ones for the southern Donetsk front line. So the Russians, if they continue pushing westwards around here, they would actually be able to cut off the Mokryali River line over here. And then the movement between areas that are circled over here that are further south would be further complicated when we're looking at sort of movements that could, connect to Novopavlivka. I suppose that because the western area, the western flank is so open, even though there aren't any paved roads, just utilizing those open fields would give the Ukrainians an opportunity to arrive at the border and cross over the Vovcha River and then get access to the Havrylivka garrison and such. But that's why the Russians are also looking to cut off the highway over here in order to ensure that the Ukrainians have to use the open fields. And then from there, it becomes difficult. You get bogged down more, and it becomes just an open season for Russian drone crews that already played a big role in the capture of Bakhatir and the following successes. And now they're going to try to move their sort of forward positions to areas like Odradny and perhaps even further westwards as time goes on. But yeah, let's move on to the situation northeast of Pokrovsk and Myrhorod. You have two advances over here of note. First of all, we're seeing finally the salient that's sort of connected between Novoekonomichny, Mykolaievka, and Yelazavetivka beginning to get smaller and smaller. So previously, it looked something like this, wherein the Ukrainians were very close to Yelazavetivka, and they maintained this crescent shape with this sort of large perimeter, and the ground forces were pretty small in size, but the Russians simply were unable to dislodge them, or they did not focus on it that much because they were more so involved in clearing out populated areas like Malinivka and Mirny, and thereby created a situation where the Ukrainians to the south, in that open area, in those salients that really lack well-designed trenches, it's an area that does consist of dugouts because of the tree lines and such, but you don't see any sort of major obstacles or fortresses that were set up. So, as a result of these Russian maneuvers, it's created a situation where the Ukrainians are now really forced to leave before they get encircled completely. And so the Russians are taking advantage of that, taking the initiative and getting control over some of these warehouses and some of these tree lines. So you can see 1.75 square kilometers of territory captured, and you could see the correction continue to extend until the front line turns into something that's more cohesive, something like this. So at the same time, we're looking at the Russians pushing and taking over the entirety of Shevchenko Persia, and now they're very close to Kopcheve. So you can see over here that the Russians advanced 2.3 square kilometers, and in terms of the push westward, it amounts to 2.6 kilometers. So Shevchenko Persia, just to look at it, it's just one road with a couple of houses. Obviously, the Ukrainians would be unable to resist in that particular area, given how isolated it is from the main Ukrainian forces, the main Ukrainian defensive structures that are located, say, 6.5 kilometers away, something of that sort. And same thing would go for Kopcheve. It is also a really small area, meaning that once the Russian forces send a platoon or even a smaller sized force, it could be through motorcycles, on foot, or could be a mechanized attack, although we haven't seen much of that over here. We did see it with the sort of large Russian breakthrough that occurred that allowed them to actually pass over the highway and push nearly 7 kilometers northwards. So in that sort of case, having an armored assault makes complete sense because you're looking at a deep breakthrough with attempts at exploitation to suppress Ukrainian fire and actually have the speed and protection at the same time to push forward. But when we're looking over here to Kopcheve, a small force could just sort of seep themselves in and naturally get control over the entirety of the populated area. And by then, you would have no other villages that are located in this sort of open region, relatively open region that is also located on a rather high elevation. You can see it over here. It's basically the area, the buffer area that separates the line of contact from the first Ukrainian line of defenses over here. This Ukrainian line of defenses that I'm referring to is what's protecting the eastern bank of the Kazany Terets River, as it's referred to. So the Russians are getting awfully close to arriving at that first line, and there are several areas where it could be penetrated. First of all, directly through Novoekonomishny and Mykolaievka, pushing through directly, and then they would have access to this industrial zone. But the issue is then you have to push through another line directly on the perimeter of Murnurad. So it seems rather unlikely that the Russians are going to put all of their efforts into this, although I do think they will try to siphon off Ukrainian control by pushing through to here. These villages are of a similar size to Myrylyubivka and Hordivka, which the Russians have been in the process of taking over, so they certainly have the capacity to do it if they so choose. But there are other areas that certainly could be more opportune. So, for instance, Razin over here and Yunakivka, like there is this line over here, which certainly does present an obstacle for the Russian side, but it could be crossed over and it is just sort of left on its own. It is sort of an isolated line of defense, not necessarily connected to any populated areas. And then you have another line of trenches that is directly connected to Razin, which is a really small hamlet. So once again, easy for Russian infantry to seep themselves in and establish a foothold and then expand from there. So this area could actually present a opportunity for the Russians to penetrate the Ukrainian lines and arrive at areas that could include this slag heap over here, which has just amazing vantage potential. That's one point. Or it could just continue pushing forward towards the next line of trenches and just continually undermine the Ukrainian layers of defense. So that's certainly a possibility. And the overarching goal, as I've continued to reiterate, is that the Russians want to further tighten the noose around Pokrovsk. They were unable to do it to a sufficient degree to the sort of west. And now they're looking at trying to cut off either directly or indirectly the northern road that connects Dobropilya to Pokrovsk. And that's not going to happen overnight because, first of all, the distances just by themselves are extremely long. You're looking at minimum 13.5 kilometers, but then everything in between is also extremely complicated. But you could already see how the Russians are going about this, and their routes, their planned routes to actually arrive and cut off access routes for the northern parts of the city. So certainly keep an eye out for this, because these movements will not be ending in the short term, and the Ukrainians are aware of this based on their troop redeployments that we'll get to later on in the video. In Yablonivka, the Russian forces are increasing intensity, and the Ukrainians are also exhibiting their defensive potential. So you have combined efforts from the 36th Marine Brigade, from the 12th Azov National Guard Brigade, the 4th Battalion of the 101st Protection Guard Brigade, and also some assistance from the 54th Mechanized Brigade, which I found to be surprising, because the 54th is located in Seversk, but they were actually mentioned in the post by the Ukrainian side that they were involved in repelling the attacks over here. So the Ukrainian attacks that they had to defend against were two-pronged. First of all, obviously the Russians are using the T-0504 highway, which is one of the benefits of the capture of that span of road, because now the Russians could use it directly to enter into populated areas or into trenches as they so choose. But Ukrainian sources, they claim that they were able to destroy 13 Russian, or rather 18 infantry fighting vehicles, most of which were BMP-3s, and damaged 5 of them as well, and also destroyed 13 motorcycles. A lot of video footage is posted to back that up, so I don't know if it's the entirety. I don't think it actually shows all of those destructions, but it shows the majority of them. And so this assault occurred on the 20th of June, and it was really what allowed the Russians to push the mantle forward and actually sort of change stalemate that had temporarily unfolded or really stayed the same for a couple of days. But now the Russians are once again increasing the pace of their assaults. And previously, in a lot of these advances that we saw over here, the Russians were not relying upon armor. They were not really utilizing that much of a BMP utilization. We didn't see that much of the MTLBs or tanks. We did see to a certain degree, but they were not in large columns of dozens of vehicles, maybe 4 at most. But now we're seeing that change, because the Russians know that they need to use them at their disposal in order to actually, get the barrel rolling, in order to actually reach central Yablonivka. All right, so we see over here the Russians were able to capture 4.47 square kilometers of territory. There's the video, I think the video is over here, from the 33rd Motor Rifle Regiment. So they conducted an armored assault in parallel, in sync with the one that occurred along the highway, and they pushed along the southern route, I believe, so pushing directly along this vertical direction, and were able to dismount forces, including motorcyclists, in the town itself, and they were filmed getting targeted by the Ukrainian drones in these houses over here. And what this indicates to us is that Yablonivka is now being enveloped. You first of all have the pressure coming in from the northwest, and part of that is not just taking over residential areas, it's also about overrunning the trenches that the Ukrainians have set up over here, because the Ukrainian obstacles, their fortifications, are really well built. They're also strategically built on heights that overlook Yablonivka. All these areas over here are on a key ridge, and it's not just your standard trench. There are inlets, there are zigzags, you have underground sections like bunkers, these really well executed dugouts as well. So everything's sort of interconnected, and there are multiple layers as well, including an anti-tank ditch. So the Russians naturally are trying to overrun that, and that goes through the highway itself. But when we're looking at the village, you see that there's this attack that occurred previously around Alexandro Kalinove, and that acts as a sort of eastern flank. And now in unison, you have the push coming in from the west. So you're beginning to see how the surface area of Yunakivka, or rather Yablonivka, is beginning to sort of get shrunk. And so the Russians are planning to squeeze them out, get control over the northern trenches, and then from there consolidate in lieu of an attack along the highway towards the southwestern entrance into Konstantinivka. That is the sort of larger plan behind all of this. Now to look just very briefly at the Seversk front. You can see over here just a capture of 0.6 square kilometers. The Russians have recently been increasing the pace of assaults in this region, and they're really looking at consolidating control over this salient, the salient that exists in between Serebryanka and the front line to the south, which is sort of centered around Verkhnokamiansk. Because this area is located at a high elevation, there aren't that many trenches. It's not a trench-dense area, but And it's enough for a small Ukrainian squad to remain situated around here and receive support from drone groups that are located in Seversk to prevent the Russians from actually pushing head on. So the Russians have instead sort of been carving out these sort of individual routes, pushing through populated areas to take them over in the hopes that it would then create the conditions to eventually squeeze the Ukrainians out of the hinterlands. So that's sort of what we're seeing unfold right now. When it comes to the actual size of the salient, I want to just give you guys an idea of the size of it. You can see that it amounts to 13 and a half square kilometers. Now, looking at the Kharkiv front, the Oskila River front, rather, you can see over here that we have two advances. First of all, in Kindrashivka, the Russians have captured the majority of the village. It amounts to nearly zero point 0.6 square kilometers of territory, and this is from June 17th. So the Storm Detachment, which has been really critical in a lot of recent Russian advances, they're part of the 27th Brigade. Again, one of the main units involved in crossing over the river across the entire front line, not just one village, but multiple villages. We've seen this brigade involved in those assaults. So their motorcyclists have entered into southern Kindrashivka, which is an important thing to note that now we're seeing the Russians utilizing motorcycles on the western side of the river, which allows them to receive or have greater mobility. Also over here, east of Duvenka, we have a video from June 19th of grenade drops onto Russian infantry as they were seeping into forested patches. So this is also occurring along a key highway. The Russians over here are trying to sort of pave a route that would allow them to access these rear villages that previously were not really within the purview of the front line, but now they are reaching that point, and they're not well defended, both in terms of the sort of number of forces that are located over here. That's one aspect of this, but also when it comes to fortifications that are surrounding the perimeter of these villages, you just simply don't have anything to show. So once the Russians enter into a certain area, the real issue for them would be logistical constraints and perhaps the Ukrainian capacity to defend through drone crews. That would be their main concern. But when it comes to overrunning the village and entering into houses, they can certainly do that. And then it would also create the conditions to overrun Fikholivka, which is located a bit to the east, because currently the Ukrainians are putting up a defensive effort over there. To finish off with Sumy, I want to zoom in on the advances that have occurred over the past few days. So it's really centered around Yunakivka. So in Yunakivka, the Russian forces have been able to take over the northern half. You can see that it amounts to 2 square kilometers. And this was admitted by Deep State, so there's really no room for debate about the actual extent of the Russian advances here. What I found interesting, though, is this report that they released. They said that there were hundreds of dragon's teeth that were just sort of left untouched. I refer to them as just being dormant. They're not being utilized. They're not being set up along the perimeter, whether it be the eastern side where you have the highway or to the north directly where the Russians would actually assault from. You just don't see any utilization of the dragon's teeth or of sandbags that were stationed right next to the road. So they were directly accessible to the Ukrainian soldiers. And it's been there for a month, according to Deep State. You can see just very faintly over here, because I know the photo is small. You can see that I have over here the photo indicating that you just had piles of dragon's teeth, hundreds of them, that were not set up. And so this really speaks to a wider systemic issue with the Ukrainian garrison in Sumy, that they were so fixated on the operations in Kursk throughout the entirety of late 2024 and early 2025, and there was no foresight by the Sumy operational tactical grouping to actually begin building up defenses for the really eventual scenario where they would be pushed out entirely and would have to actually be on the back foot and defend in their own territory. So there was just no foresight, no consideration of the future by the Ukrainian command in the Sumy grouping, and also more generally in the Khortytsia grouping, which is supposed to, encompass all of this area as well. So, you could lay the finger at a lot of figures. For instance, last year, it was May of 2024, I remember this, when the Russians launched their initial movements in the offensive into Kharkiv through the Liptsy and Vovchansk axes. The Ukrainians were just wholly unprepared. Their trenches were not sufficient to contain the offensive, and it allowed the Russians to penetrate distances that amounted to 10, 15 kilometers before encountering Ukrainian resistance on the ground through ground forces, not through prepared defensive positions. And then eventually, the command over here was able to stabilize the situation. But what that included was an urban battle that continues to rage in Vovchansk. And so that initial failure is what now means that the front line has shifted by that sort of amount, and means that there is going to be this sort of permanent Russian presence in the area. But that's not to take away from Ukraine's offensive successes over here. But the issue is the initial Russian breakthrough that occurred. And something similar has manifested in the Sumy region, in the sense that there was simply no foresight. And you'd expect that after the debacle that occurred in May of 2024 in Kharkiv, which led to the firing of Yuri Sodol. He was the guy that was blamed for the entire situation, and he had his entire command sort of switched around. So he's been shifted around and mixed with various other commanders. He hasn't kept the same post for a while now, and you're seeing it a lot now that there are these three or four figures in the Ukrainian high command that continue switching positions. So you have Yuri Sodol, you have Natov, you have Drapati, who recently resigned from the ground forces and was actually given a new position as the head of the joint forces of the armed forces of Ukraine. So that's also a very high ranking position. And obviously Siersky was given a bunch of roles before he got the highest one. But what I'm saying is that since January, Drapati, who's been really long praised as being the sort of anti-corruption crusader in Ukraine, since January he's been in charge of the Hortitsia grouping, which includes foresight or includes supervision over Sumy. And so you could really lay the blame at him in the same way that Sodol was blamed for the situation that occurred in Kharkiv. So that's one thing. And all in all, Drapati was the ground forces commander for 7 months. So that is a notable period of time. And to his credit, if we're looking at sort of like the positives of his administration, now that he's no longer at the post, he was involved in stabilizing the situation with a lot of the 150 series brigades, the ones that were created under the NATO standards, the 15 brigades that were set up with the 140, 150, 160 sort of number behind them. He was able to, address a lot of the corruption issues in those units and ensure that new ones weren't created as well, and the ones that had already been formed actually have all the resources that they need in order to be effective on the front line. So that's certainly a positive. But I don't know. I'm just speculating about what happened in Sumy. But the fact of the matter is that for a month, you had these materials prepared over here that could have been used to, at the very least, drag out the fighting in Yunakivka, but they were just delayed dormant over there for a long time. And when we look at trenches, there were not that many set up in Yunakivka in general. And the Ukrainians, they launched the Kursk offensive. It was in August. So they've had an extended period of time, not a year, like 10 months, we'd say, to get everything ready over here for a scenario wherein the Kursk offensive would fail, which certainly the Ukrainians should have anticipated to a certain degree. Even if they were confident about it, they should have had a backup case, as we're seeing now. And so the fact that they didn't set up any of these major trenches that we see set up, for instance, around Konstantinivka, that's a good example of where defensive barricades actually are doing a great job, because they include the anti-tank layer, they include the mines, they include the barbed wire as well, and they include very deep trenches. The only trenches that we see over here are positional trenches that were set up over the past month, and they get destroyed by drones. Drones impact them, and they're very shallow, they're not deep, and then they get damaged. They can't really be utilized. And so Yunakivka was just completely unprepared, despite all of the emphasis that was put on defending it by Ukrainian manpower. So it's not like there's a manpower issue around here. A lot of Ukrainian forces are deployed to this region. It's about the fact that they don't really have an area to organize and effectively utilize that manpower. So the Russians obviously took advantage of these facts and have now been able to infiltrate into the town directly, and will, by extension, take over the rest of it in the near future. And so that's sort of my tangent on the Sumy situation and the lack of foresight. But I do want to say that now the Ukrainians are looking forward into the future, and they've established the 20th Army Corps. And this actually, I would say, in terms of the structure of the units, does seem to make sense, because in a lot of other Army Corps, the brigades are not actually along the same part of the line of contact. They're just completely separated. One's in Sumy, one's in Zaporozhye, one's in Luhansk, which I don't understand, because you want to have a core headquarters that can actually be accessible to all of the brigades. And so now the Ukrainians are probably realizing this and have shifted around some of the corps and the brigades that are within those corps. So the 20th Corps will include the 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade. Let me zoom in and show you guys that. You can see over here. 17th Heavy Mechanized Brigade, they were redeployed from Sumy to defend around the Russian breakthrough that's occurring right now in Shevchenko, Persia. So that should give you an idea of why this part of the front line is so critical. The Ukrainians clearly understood that it actually requires taking away from Sumy, where obviously you also have a lot of Ukrainian defensive emphasis. So that's one thing. You also have the 23rd, 31st, 33rd, and 141st Brigades as a part of this Army Corps. So the 23rd, 31st, and 33rd are located in very close proximity. I could actually pinpoint them on the map over here. 31st is located west of the Mokrali River. 141st is generally in the same area, and then 33rd is a bit to the north, defending along the Vavcha River. So you do have a pretty logical sort of situation when it comes to the placement of these units. Same thing with 23rd Brigade, which I know is located over here. So the only unit that sort of sticks out would be the 17th Brigade, and it isn't that far away necessarily. So you could have a Corps headquarters that is located on the rear somewhere in Dnipro, somewhere like Mezhova or Slavyanka, and it would be pretty logical. So these are the sort of blueprints that all the other Army Corps should have. And there should be movements. For instance, you had the movement of the 33rd Brigade. It previously was in the 10th Army Corps, and that wasn't really a good idea. It didn't really make sense given the other units there. So it's been shuffled around. So that's possible. There's still a chance to do that because the actual implementation of the Army Corps headquarters hasn't really gone into full swing yet. So there's still a chance to change the build-up, I would say. So that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. And tell me, guys, if you guys want to see a video about Iran, because if you guys do, then that's the next video I'm going to upload because, the situation there is beginning to escalate now. So thank you guys so much and goodbye.